During October 1941, German forces accomplished something that appeared unthinkable, trapping close to 700,000 Red Army troops in under a fortnight. This massive encirclement led the Führer to proclaim that victory was assured. However, in just 8 weeks, this supreme triumph would become the prelude to the Reich's first catastrophic defeat, precisely because the completeness of their victory blinded them to the abyss ahead. October 1941 stands as one of the most revealing moments of the entire Second World War. The battles of Vyazma and Bryansk were not merely tactical victories. They were a methodical, ideologically driven process of mass encirclement, extermination, and deliberate neglect that represented the Wehrmacht at its most terrifyingly efficient, yet brutally inhumane. This is the story of how supreme military victory bred fatal German arrogance, how operational brilliance enabled crimes against humanity, and how the destruction of 3 entire Soviet army groups led directly to Germany's defeat at the gates of Moscow. This is the story of the moment when the Wehrmacht revealed its true nature and sealed its own fate. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. In the span of days, the Soviet Union lost more soldiers than most nations fielded in their entire armies. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. Between 675,000 and 700,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in 2 massive encirclements in less than 14 days of operations. To put this in perspective, this matched or exceeded the scale of the catastrophic Kiev encirclement just weeks earlier. 3 entire Soviet army groups, the Western Front under General Ivan Konev, the Reserve Front under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, and the Bryansk Front under General Andrei Yeremenko, were simultaneously destroyed in a coordinated double pincer, movement that showcased German operational art at its absolute peak. The encirclements represented the culmination of blitzkrieg doctrine. Mobile armored spearheads penetrated deep into Soviet rear areas, cutting communications and supply lines. Combined arms coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power functioned with mechanical precision. The tempo of operations moved faster than Soviet commanders could react. German forces advanced 150 to 250 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, a rate of movement that paralyzed Soviet decision-making and shattered the cohesion of defending armies. The results seemed to validate every assumption of German military superiority. The racial theories that classified Slavs as inferior appeared confirmed by battlefield results. The Red Army seemed incapable of coordinated defense against the Wehrmacht's operational system. Soviet command structure completely fragmented under the German assault. Front commanders lost contact with their armies. Army commanders lost contact with their divisions. Division commanders lost contact with their regiments. The carefully constructed defensive lines west of Moscow, built with over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 7,600 guns, disintegrated in days. General Konev's Western Front headquarters struggled to maintain any coherent picture of the battlefield. Marshal Budyonny's Reserve Front evaporated as German panzers sliced through its positions. General Yeremenko's Bryansk Front found itself encircled before it could execute any organized withdrawal. The scale and speed of the catastrophe left Soviet high command in Moscow reeling, desperately trying to scrape together reserves to defend the capital itself. But how did the Wehrmacht achieve this staggering victory with such terrifying speed and precision? Operation Typhoon began with 3 armored spearheads slicing through Soviet defenses like surgical instruments through tissue. On October 2, 1941, 3 German panzer groups launched coordinated attacks along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. In the north, Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Erich Höppner's 4th Panzer Group drove southeast toward Vyazma. In the south, Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck north from the Bryansk area. The operational design was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. The northern pincers would meet behind Vyazma, trapping the bulk of the western and reserve fronts. The southern pincer would encircle the Bryansk front separately. Together, they would destroy Soviet armies west of Moscow before those forces could retreat to defend the capital. The speed of the German advance shocked even veteran Soviet commanders. On October 3rd, just the second day of operations, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group captured the city of Orel, 150 kilometers behind the supposed front line. Soviet defenders were still eating breakfast when German tanks rolled into the city center. The advance maintained a rate of 50 kilometers per day, a pace that exemplified operational shock. Soviet units attempting to establish new defensive lines found German tanks already in their rear areas before the positions could be fortified. Communications broke down as German spearheads cut telephone lines and overran radio stations. Soviet commanders issued orders to units that no longer existed or could not be reached. Devastating air-ground coordination multiplied the effect of the armored assault. Luftflotte 2 flew hundreds of sorties daily, with waves of Stuka dive bombers hitting Soviet positions just ahead of advancing panzers. Medium bombers struck Soviet headquarters, supply depots, and troop concentrations in the rear. By October 7th, German forces had closed 2 massive pockets. The northern pincer snapped shut around Vyazma, trapping the bulk of 4 Soviet armies. The southern pincer closed around Bryansk, encircling 3 more Soviet armies. The speed of the encirclement gave Soviet forces no time to organize coherent withdrawal or establish escape corridors. Units that might have retreated in good order found themselves surrounded before commanders even realized the danger. As the pincers closed with mechanical precision, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in shrinking pockets. But what awaited them inside would prove far worse than the battle itself. For the trapped Soviet soldiers, the encirclement transformed from military defeat into a descent into hell. Inside the pockets, the experience of encirclement meant the complete breakdown of military organization and the onset of desperate survival. Soviet armies that had maintained defensive positions just days earlier now found themselves cut off from supply, reinforcement, and command. The Luftwaffe intensified its assault on the trapped formations. Hundreds of sorties daily rained bombs on concentrations of troops that had nowhere to hide. Soviets. Survivors described the experience as a continuous hell. Bombers appeared in waves throughout daylight hours. There were no shelters, no bunkers, no effective anti-aircraft guns. Men huddled in shallow trenches or beneath trees, waiting for the next attack they could hear but not stop. Mass psychological collapse followed the physical breakdown of organization. Soldiers who had fought effectively in defensive positions now faced relentless bombardment without food, ammunition, or hope of relief. The realization of encirclement, that there was no escape, no reinforcement, no possibility of victory, broke the will of entire units. Mass surrenders began within days of the pockets closing. Men emerged from forests with hands raised, desperate for food and water. German accounts describe Soviet soldiers approaching German lines in groups of hundreds, sometimes thousands, too exhausted and demoralized to continue resistance. By October 13th, German forces declared the Vyazma pocket destroyed. By October 20th, organized resistance in both pockets had collapsed. But as Soviet soldiers emerged from the pockets with hands raised in surrender, they were about to discover that capture was not salvation. It was the beginning of systematic extermination. The fate of the 514,000 to 600,000 prisoners taken at Vyazma-Bryansk was determined not by battlefield conditions, but by orders written in Berlin. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was not a logistical failure. It was not the unfortunate result of supply shortages or the chaos of rapid advance. It was the deliberate implementation of Nazi racial doctrine, specifically the Hunger Plan. Explicit orders from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht denied Soviet prisoners of war food, shelter, and medical care. These were not suggestions or guidelines for difficult circumstances. They were direct commands implemented at every level of the military hierarchy. A German regimental diary from the Vyazma encirclement captures the policy with chilling brevity. No rations for Russians. Let them die. Orders from above. This single sentence, written by an ordinary German officer documenting daily operations, reveals how ideology translated into action at the field level. The orders came from above, but they were implemented by regular Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS death squads. The starvation policy was not the work of ideological fanatics operating outside military channels. It was official Wehrmacht policy executed by the regular army as part of normal operations. The death marches from Vyazma and Bryansk left trails of corpses stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The encirclements produced scenes of industrialized suffering that revealed the true nature of German policy towards Soviet prisoners. Masses of captured soldiers were herded into open fields without food, shelter, or medical care. Deliberate exposure became a method of killing. German guards prevented prisoners from building shelters or foraging for food. Men stood or sat in open fields for days, then weeks, as autumn cold and rain sapped their strength. The dead were not buried. Bodies accumulated in piles as guards watched and did nothing. 40% of prisoners died on forced marches before even reaching permanent camps. Those who fell behind were shot. Those who asked for water were beaten or shot. Those too weak to continue were left by the roadside to die. The camps were not designed to hold prisoners. They were designed to kill them slowly. 80 to 90% of the Vyazma-Bryansk prisoners died within months of capture. Of the 600,000 Soviet soldiers taken prisoner in these encirclements, only 10 to 20% survived to spring 1942. The primary causes were starvation, exposure, and disease, all the direct result of deliberate policy. While hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died in camps and on marches, their German captors were celebrating what they believed was the war's decisive victory. In the flush of victory, German commanders made the fatal error of believing their own propaganda about Soviet collapse. Hitler declared, "The war is won," immediately after the encirclements were completed. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, described the Red Army as finished in his diary. Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote that the Red Army was broken and would never rise again. Senior German commanders began planning victory parades in Moscow, scheduled for early November. This overconfidence led to a catastrophic intelligence failure. German intelligence at Foreign Armies East dismissed evidence of Soviet reserve mobilization. They concluded that the Soviets could not possibly raise significant new forces after the losses at Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk. They assumed that the Red Army's ability to regenerate was limited by the same factors that would have limited a Western European army. But the Soviet Union was not France. The Soviet political system was willing to accept losses that would have broken any Western European state. The Soviet population, facing a war of annihilation, fought with a desperation unknown in earlier German campaigns. The Soviet Union was raising over 1 million fresh troops, even as German commanders celebrated victory. The fatal decision to press toward Moscow, despite exhaustion, deteriorating weather, and the approaching Rasputitsa, followed directly from this overconfidence. If the Red Army was truly broken, if Moscow was about to fall, then pushing forward despite difficulties made sense. This decision would prove to be one of the most catastrophic strategic errors of the entire war. The paradox at the heart of German success was this: the very operational brilliance that achieved encirclement created conditions that made ultimate victory impossible. Reducing the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets required over 2 weeks of sustained combat. Those 2 weeks consumed crucial time during the narrow window before mud season and, if winter, every day spent destroying trapped Soviet forces was a day not spent advancing toward Moscow. Every infantry division tied down containing the pockets was a division unavailable for the final push. The thoroughness of German operational doctrine, the insistence on completely destroying encircled forces rather than bypassing them, created a strategic cost that would prove fatal. By the time German forces resumed the advance toward Moscow in late October, they faced a fundamentally different situation. The Rasputitsa had arrived. The autumn rains turned unpaved roads into quagmires. Vehicles that had raced across dry ground in early October now struggled to move at all. Panzer divisions that had advanced 50 kilometers per day now struggled to advance 5 kilometers per day through knee-deep mud. Tanks bogged down and had to be towed free. Supply columns bogged down, creating fuel and ammunition shortages at the front. The operational system that had functioned brilliantly in the opening days of Typhoon was breaking down under the strain of geography. German units found themselves immobilized not by enemy action, but by the earth itself. The time consumed reducing the Vyazma-Bryansk pockets meant the Wehrmacht hit the mud season, while still over 100 kilometers from Moscow. If German forces had bypassed the pockets and pushed directly toward Moscow in early October, they might have reached the capital's outskirts before the rains began. Instead, the operational choice to thoroughly reduce the pockets meant that the Wehrmacht's mobile warfare capability was neutralized by weather before it could achieve the strategic objective. For weeks, the Germans wallowed in the mud, their supplies dwindling, their men exhausted. Then in mid-November, the temperature dropped, the mud hardened. The roads, previously impassable rivers of sludge, became solid highways once again. To the German command, this felt like a divine intervention. The mobility of the panzers was restored. The advance could resume, but this freezing of the ground was a trap in itself. It signaled the arrival of General Winter. The Wehrmacht had prepared for a summer campaign. They had expected the war to be over by October. The soldiers were still wearing lightweight summer tunics. The tanks were using standard oil that turned into a thick, glue-like sludge in sub-zero temperatures. There was no antifreeze for the radiators. As the German forces launched their final lunge toward Moscow in mid-November, the thermometer began to plummet. 10 degrees Celsius, then 20, then 30. The suffering of the German soldier in these weeks defies description. Without winter clothing, frostbite became an epidemic. Men stuffed newspapers into their boots and coats in a desperate attempt to retain heat. Weapons jammed as the lubricants froze. To start a tank engine, crews had to light fires underneath the chassis to thaw the oil, a dangerous practice that sometimes destroyed the vehicle itself. Yet, despite the cold, the German war machine ground forward. They were driven by the sight of the objective. By early December, reconnaissance units from the 2nd Panzer Division reached the town of Khimki, just 8 kilometers from Moscow's city limits. Through their binoculars, German officers could reportedly see the golden domes of the Kremlin shimmering in the frosty air. They were so close, they could see the trolley buses moving in the streets of the capital. But looking at the objective is not the same as taking it. The German force that reached Khimki was a skeleton. Regiments were reduced to battalion strength. Companies were commanded by lieutenants or sergeants because the captains were dead. The supply lines, stretched over 1,000 kilometers of frozen, partisan-infested wasteland, had snapped. While the Germans were freezing, the Soviet Union was pulling off a miracle of mobilization. Throughout October and November, while the Germans were stuck in the mud or clearing the Vyazma pockets, Stalin and his top general, Georgy Zhukov, had been methodically rebuilding the defense. They didn't just dig trenches, they transformed Moscow into a fortress. But the most decisive factor came from the east. For months, the Soviet High Command had kept its best troops, the Siberian divisions, stationed in the Far East, guarding against a potential invasion by Imperial Japan. These men were fresh, they were well fed, they were equipped with quilted winter uniforms, felt boots and fur caps. They were trained to fight in the snow. Their weapons were lubricated with winter oil that didn't freeze. In October, a Soviet spy in Tokyo named Richard Sorge sent a critical message to Moscow. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. They were preparing to strike the United States and Britain in the Pacific. This intelligence saved Moscow. Stalin ordered the immediate transfer of the Siberian divisions to the west. Thousands of trains moved in secret, transporting hundreds of thousands of hardened soldiers, thousands of T-34 tanks, and massive artillery reserves to the forests around Moscow. German intelligence, blinded by arrogance and the belief that the Red Army was finished, missed this entirely. They believed there were no reserves left. They thought the soldiers facing them in the trenches were the last scrapings of the Soviet barrel. On December 5, 1941, the temperature was minus 38 degrees Celsius. The German offensive had finally stalled, frozen in place by the weather and the exhaustion of the troops. The Wehrmacht was at its absolute limit, extended like a rubber band ready to snap. That was the moment Zhukov chose to strike. The Soviet counteroffensive did not begin with a whimper, but with a roar. Massive artillery barrages tore into the frozen German lines. Out of the white mist came the Siberians. They came on skis, moving silently through the deep snow that immobilized German infantry. They came with T-34, tanks painted white, invisible until they were hundreds of meters away. The impact on the German army was catastrophic. The psychological shock was absolute. The subhuman enemy, whom they were told was defeated, broken, and starving, was suddenly attacking with fresh, well-equipped, and aggressive formations. Panic, something the Wehrmacht had never experienced in the war thus far, began to set in. Units that had conquered Poland and France in weeks now broke and ran. But in the deep snow, you cannot run. The retreat became a rout. Heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, had to be abandoned because engines wouldn't start or vehicles were frozen to the ground. General Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, begged Hitler for permission to retreat to a defensible line. Hitler refused, issuing his famous halt order: stand fast, do not take a single step back. While this order may have prevented a total disintegration of the front, similar to Napoleon's retreat in 1812, it condemned tens of thousands of German soldiers to death by freezing and Soviet encirclement. The hunter had become the hunted. By January 1942, the German army had been pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The threat to the capital was over. The Wehrmacht had suffered over 830,000 casualties since the start of the invasion. The Battle of Moscow was the first time in World War II that the German war machine was stopped and thrown back. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Blitzkrieg could be defeated. But the seeds of this defeat were sown in the victory of October. The destruction of the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets was a masterpiece of military art, a tactical triumph that few armies in history could replicate. But it was a strategic suicide. By focusing on the perfection of the encirclement, by obsessing over the complete destruction of the Soviet armies in the pockets, the Germans spent the only currency that mattered: time. They traded the capture of Moscow for the capture of 700,000 prisoners. They traded strategic victory for a tactical record. The arrogance born at Vyazma, the belief that the enemy was subhuman, that the war was already won, that logistics and weather could be ignored, led directly to the frozen hell of December. The 700,000 Soviet soldiers who were captured and left to die in the open fields of Vyazma did not die in vain. Their sacrifice, the 2 weeks they bought with their lives while being ground down in the pockets, delayed the German advance just long enough for the mud to fall, for the snow to come, and for the Siberians to arrive. The Wehrmacht won the battle in October, but in doing so, they ensured they would lose the war. If you found this analysis of the Eastern Front compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more historical deep dives. Thanks for watching.